The next speaker for today is a San Francisco Bay Area based non-fiction author. Her writing has appeared in several regional and national magazines in the United States. She was a monthly columnist for India Currents magazine, where she wrote a popular column entitled On English. A feature she wrote won the New America Media Prize, and some of these columns won the San Francisco Peninsula Prize. And she also won the first prize at a competition at Kepler's Books in Menlo Park. And the list goes on and on. I don't want to take up more of her talking time to you, so let me just introduce. So please help me welcome Kalpana Mohan, our next author.
Thank you so much, Deepthi. It's a pleasure to speak to TiEcon all the way from Singapore, where it's 12:15, so 12:30 rather. So imagine that you are 88 years old. Imagine too that you've been diagnosed with an incurable condition. There are just two choices. One is an invasive procedure in which the risks are high for a person your age. The other is the better option. In October 2012, my father chose that second option. He told his doctors that he had had a good life and that he would just remain the way he was until the end. Until the end. The problem, as we all know and have been reminded of over and over by the coronavirus, is we never know how that end of all ends arrives. My book, Daddy-kins, a memoir of my father and I, is about the things that happened as we waited for our father's end. My sister, Urmila, and I had no idea how long he still had to live, but we decided that she and I would make the most of the gift of time that we had been given with him. With our mother gone for over 7 years, Dad was all we had. And like he always said when we got extra mad at him, now why would you say that to me? I'm the only father you have, he would say. You see how Daddykins was a master manipulator. Still, he was so funny that the people who read about him on Facebook told me they wanted to read a book about him. So you see, that's how this book was born, on the pages of Facebook. Now, let me begin with one of the first posts that I wrote about him on Facebook in the fall of 2012, while I began living with him in his home in India's Chennai, sorry. In the morning, Daddykins was buried behind the newspaper, as always, when Vinayakan, Daddykins' chauffeur, observed that the obituary section of the newspaper, The Hindu, was growing longer by the day. See how there's a lot of money in death these days, Amma? Our driver philosopher said to me. Just one photo and the name of the deceased, and it brings so much cash for the paper. Naturally, it makes financial sense to devote more space to death. I tapped Daddykins on the arm as he sat in his rust-orange sofa. I asked him why he read the obituary section every single morning. Just to make sure that my name isn't there, my father said, by accident. Saying that, he laughed until his nose turned red and he came up for air. That was Daddykins, quirky, eccentric, all the way until the morning he died in June 2014. But the 2 years my sister and I spent with our father gave us memories for a lifetime. During that time, we talked endlessly about his life, his accomplishments, and his regrets. I read out aloud to him. He stopped me sometimes during my reading to reflect on what I had just read. We escorted him to concerts where he fell asleep before the concert even began. I ferried him to every house he had ever lived in during the 65 years he had spent in Chennai. He could barely swallow a morsel on some days, but the day he asked me to take him out for coffee and for a macaroon at a local hotel, I didn't hesitate. Thank goodness. The day came when he couldn't even ingest water. One afternoon, my sister and I and Vinayakam also led him to the waters by the ancient rock temples of Mahabalipuram. The four of us stood by the 7th century ruins as the waves crashed against the rocks, reminding us of all those who had stood there before us. 16 weeks before he passed away, we drove him to his hometown in Palakkad, 350 miles away, for one last visit to the temple deity that he hoped would renew his life in some way. But what man proposes, God invariably disposes. On Father's Day, 40 minutes after midnight, while we paced outside his room, worrying about his breathing, Dadikins drifted away like cotton from the kapok tree. Through the air conditioning unit, perhaps the balcony, or the bathroom window, perhaps. A few hours after his final exhalation, the late Dadikins' kitchen scissors with an orange handle severed in two. Thank you for listening. I guess the only reason all of you are at TiEcon is because you've been lucky enough to be schooled in the tongue that went on to become the language in which science and technology were taught, thanks to the British Empire and American imperialism. But what if you were a woman like my mother, born in 1931 into an Orthodox family in South India? You were most likely never in school. In my mother's view, until the day she died, the world of English was merely a cold planet in an alternate universe filled with people who had a crick in their neck. I can assure you that her view is hardly different from that of people in France or China, although they too have now grudgingly picked up the English language simply to be able to compete with the rest of the world. As British linguist David Crystal pointed out a few years ago, power always drives language, and English will be in power at least for the foreseeable future. That brings me to my second book, An English Made in India, How a Foreign Language Became Local. In 2015, an editor at Delhi's Aleph Book Company, who happened upon my columns for India Currents, wondered if I'd be interested in writing an entertaining narrative about Indianisms in the English language. My interest was piqued, but I didn't want to stop with the oddities of India's English. The way one speaks English is often closely tied to one's mother tongue, whether it's India or Singapore or the Philippines, and that leads to many hilarious moments in social interactions. But I wanted to go beyond all that by talking to many people across India, teachers, writers, thinkers, translators, technologists, and so on, to learn about what the English language had wrought in India over the country's 350-year history with Britain. I traveled to many parts of India, to places seminal to the evolution of the English language, the metropolises of Bombay, Madras, Calcutta, Delhi, of course, but there were other places too. A principal at a high school far away in the mountain ranges of Himachal Pradesh struggles to impart English to children of farmers who were first-time learners of the English language. With only about the top 10% of India being fluent speakers of English, the most lucrative business in India is running an English medium school. English opens doors, you see. But do you know how English is equated with intellect too? That is the tragedy of how a language can begin to embody a quality simply because it's the conduit of the quality to the rest of the world. English thus creates a divide, even in India's coveted administrative services, where somebody who is otherwise brilliant is somehow tainted for not being fluent in the English language. My travels informed my book in countless ways. While talking to the erstwhile princess of Travancore in Kerala, I discovered how children in royal families mastered the English language very early because of their exposure to families from England. In Delhi, while talking to Sir Mark Tully, a renowned BBC correspondent, I realized how he understood very clearly, more than most Indians actually, that I had met, how best to preserve India's languages while offering free education to the poor. He believed that English medium was not so important, but that the solid teaching of the English language, even in government schools, was critical. I was often astounded by the pluckiness of people with respect to using English in daily life. I discovered how an illiterate woman in Chennai mastered enough English to take people to court. One man, Danish Seth, a stand up comedian in Bangalore, used his mastery of Indian English to build a huge following on social media and poke fun at the government. In Kolkata, the capital of the British Raj, I discovered the real cost of English language in India. A poet who could have chosen to write in English swore to write only in Bengali. She believed that India's adoption of English had hurt the growth and creativity of its 22 regional languages, 200 plus dialects, literatures, and stymied the world of translation. I will never forget the time that I spent in her home, in the home of the late Nabanita Dev Sen, who was driving towards that oneness we could all achieve as Indians, really as human beings, if only we would harness our ability to feel, to imagine, to recognize, and to know that through the mirror of translation, one can see one's own head on another's shoulder. Thank you so much to TiEcon, to the opportunity to present both my books today. They're both available on Amazon, and I hope you read them and feel that in some way you were changed by them. Thank you so much, Deepti.
Thank you. Thank you, Kalpana. Such a pleasure always to hear from you. And again, like I mentioned, all our authors have their books in Authors Corner, where you can browse them and purchase them, or you can meet the authors in the networking lounge. Of course, in Kalpana's case, she moved away from Silicon Valley to Singapore, so it's almost the middle of the night. But thank you again for making this happen.